Hello and welcome back to the Idaho Reports podcast. I'm Logan Finney. Joining us this week is Dr. Emily Jungheim, who works with the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Northwestern University, here to talk about IVF or in vitro fertilization. Doctor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk with you.
So here in Idaho, the state legislature is, of course, doing a lot of policy work around abortion, around reproduction and fertility. And something that comes up frequently in those conversations is IVF or in vitro fertilization. Obviously, I'm not a scientist, and a lot of our audience is not either. Could you explain for us how IVF works and what that process looks like?
Yeah. So IVF is a process by which we take a woman's eggs out of the ovaries surgically. Not all the eggs, just the ones we need or that we can get during that particular cycle. We take those eggs and we inseminate them with sperm in a dish, and then we grow embryos from those eggs and sperm. And then we take those embryos that result and can transfer them back into a patient's uterus. The resulting embryos can also be frozen for her future use. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts of the process.
When we're looking at this in one, let's call it a round of IVF treatment, typically how many eggs are harvested there and how many embryos does that result in?
It all depends on a number of different factors. So, the concept or the term that we use to describe how many eggs we could potentially get is called ovarian reserve. And an individual's ovarian reserve is kind of biologically determined, but it can change with age. So, for example, let's say I have a 32-year-old woman who comes to see me and she needs IVF to have a baby. If I look at her ovaries on ultrasound, I can do what's called an antral follicle count and get an idea of what I think I could potentially get there if I stimulate her ovaries. Another lab we can check is an anti-Mullerian hormone level, or AMH. That's a hormone made by all the follicles within the ovary. So I use those two pieces to help me understand how many eggs could I potentially get and how should I stimulate the patient's ovaries to get those eggs. I would say on average, overall, if you look at a big population of women coming through for IVF, on average, it's about 10 eggs. And if you think about a natural menstrual cycle, we get one egg per month to try. And so IVF, if you get 10 to 12 eggs, gosh, that's almost a whole year's worth of trying to reproduce in one cycle. Um, but we all know that there's a lot of attrition from the number of eggs you get to the number of embryos you get that could potentially become a live birth. And so the process is made more efficient and effective if you can get more eggs at a time. Um, Having said that, you can get too many eggs. So I kind of call it the Goldilocks approach. We want not too many, not too few, just what's right, because the ovaries are normally about the size of a walnut. And when you recruit a follicle and ovulate in a natural menstrual cycle, that follicle within the ovary, it grows to about the size of, I'd say, a quarter. And so if I stimulate somebody's ovaries and let's say that I am recruiting 24 eggs or 2 years worth of eggs, I mean, her ovaries could be the size of cantaloupes, which can be really uncomfortable and put her at risk for different adverse outcomes. So, there's some nuance to it, but to make a long answer short, I'd say 10 is the average, but if we can safely get more, that would certainly make the process more efficient for someone.
And then once you've harvested those eggs, they are fertilized in vitro in the petri dish in the lab.
Mhm.
Um, of course, most people aren't going to want 10 children all at once. So what then happens to those embryos that have been fertilized?
So it's important to keep in mind that most eggs that we get, they're not necessarily going to fertilize. And even if they do fertilize, many of those fertilized eggs don't continue to develop. There's a lot of attrition from the number of eggs we get to the number that fertilize to the number that become embryos and then the number of embryos that can actually become a live birth. This attrition that we see or drop off of fertilized eggs to embryos, that drop off increases as we get older. And most of that is attributable to the fact that in order for an embryo to develop normally and become a live birth, it has to have a certain number of chromosomes. As we get older, the chromosomal pairs within the oocytes don't separate as well. And so we're more likely to get too many copies of a chromosome or too few copies of a chromosome. The most common example of that most people think about is trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, but because that's one that can actually survive to a live birth. But we've got 23 chromosomes. So why don't you hear about other forms of aneuploidy? Because most of those embryos are either not going to implant or they'll result in an early miscarriage. Um, and so that's just kind of to shed light on the fact that the reproductive process or human reproduction is actually really, really inefficient. IVF can be helpful because it gives you more to work with and increases the probability that you'll get an embryo that can actually give you a baby.
When someone undergoes IVF treatment and ends up with more embryos than are going to actually be implanted and born as children, what's kind of the long-term storage, or what sort of options are there for the embryos that aren't being used?
Yeah, so I think it's important first and foremost to recognize that most people who go through IVF are not going to have embryos in excess of what they're going to use. I mean, that doesn't mean that they won't have excess embryos. It's certainly possible, but I will say from being someone who's been in practice for about 20 years, it's rare that you see somebody with lots of embryos in excess of what they need to build their own families. But when that does happen, what are the options? Um, you could keep them in cryo storage indefinitely. That's not ideal. It's expensive, and I think it also logistically can be difficult. Put those embryos at risk for having an outcome that someone doesn't want. Um, the other piece of it is, it leaves people with kind of these um, unclosed chapters in life sometimes. Anyway, I guess as I think out loud, what I would say is leaving embryos in cryo storage. I think sometimes it's just a sign of people having uncertainty and maybe struggling with what to do with those embryos. And that's where we'll ask health psychologists to help people kind of talk through what are my options, what feels right. The other options include donating the embryos to another couple or another individual who would like to have a child, but maybe can't go through IVF or has tried and been unsuccessful. The embryos could be donated to research. What's difficult about the research piece is, unfortunately, there's not a lot of investment in embryo research. One, two, there's not a lot of NIH funding available for embryo research. And so there just aren't many places to donate those embryos to for research. And then some couples will, or individuals will consider transferring the embryo at a time when they can't become pregnant. That's called a compassionate transfer. Um, Overall, though, there've been some studies that have shown that when people do have success with IVF and they have excess embryos in cryo storage, those embryos kind of hold more value than, uh, let's say, just maybe sometimes people think they're cord blood after delivery. Those embryos may have more importance to somebody than just cord blood. And so, I think it just shows that it could be an important decision, and that's where a health psychologist could be helpful in talking through the options of what to do with those embryos.
When we're looking nationwide, roughly how many families take advantage of IVF, and if you have the numbers for it, how many children have been born as a result of that?
So it's really tough. If you were to look at a map of where IVF centers are located, they tend to be located in big cities. And so, um, folks who are in more rural communities where it may take several hours to get to an IVF center, they may not use IVF as much as folks who live in larger cities. Another piece of the puzzle is insurance coverage for IVF. So most people actually don't have coverage for the procedure. And so if you're paying out of pocket, it can be cost prohibitive if you need IVF to have a baby, and you may be left involuntarily childless as a result. So if you look at who's taking advantage of these techniques, it's usually people who have insurance coverage. There are states that have mandates written out that may improve insurance coverage. So, for example, where I am, I'm in Illinois, there's a mandate that employer-based insurance, someone who has employer-based insurance would have benefits to utilize IVF. And there are different loopholes to that, but for the most part, most of the people who have employer-based insurance in Illinois have pretty good coverage for IVF, and a lot of people take advantage of that. Um, again, to kind of make a long story short, I would say in states with coverage, you're going to see more people take advantage of the benefit of that of this technology. In terms of how many babies are born from this technology in the United States, it's about 2% of newborns per year. I kind of heard somebody make a interesting analogy once. If you look at the general population, that's about the proportion of people you'll see out there with red hair.
It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think of how many people there are, that's a lot of individuals. Yeah.
Yeah, and we all know somebody with red hair. And so, and it's going to change through time. I mean, the oldest child born from IVF was in the 1970s. 1982 was the first person born from IVF in the United States. So, it's not that common among older folks, but if you look at teenagers today, for example, you're definitely going to encounter somebody who is here who wouldn't be here without IVF.
I know we have at least one lawmaker in our state legislature who was able to conceive and have a child through IVF. And as they're talking about these issues in the state legislature, Idaho, of course, is a very Republican, very pro-life state, but we've heard from a lot of these policy leaders that they want to make sure that IVF is protected and that there aren't any unintended consequences that make those procedures less available for Idaho families. From your perspective as a doctor in this area, what sort of things do they need to keep in mind as they're working within the legal landscape?
Biology is really, really complicated and difficult. And then you add a layer of this human drive to have children and family. I think that's where I may end up speaking more from a personal perspective, but I am biased, particularly given what I do in working with people who are really they just want to be parents. Um, when you start writing laws about these things that are complex and that are nuanced, sometimes it can have unintended consequences and make it difficult for these things to actually be done in practice. Um, I think oftentimes when laws are being written, I'd like to think that being done with good intentions. But as we saw in Alabama, you can have unintended consequences where people say, look, I'm nervous that I could become criminally liable if I am practicing to help these people have babies.
And for context, in Alabama, that was a court in that state had ruled that frozen embryos were legally classified as children, and then that had some knock-on effects. Am I remembering right?
Yeah, yeah. So what happened when that decision was handed down, a lot of clinics said, whoa, 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 if embryos are gonna be considered children or humans, what happens if someone doesn't get pregnant or they have a miscarriage or abnormal pregnancy, or let's say an embryo gets lost in the process? Because these are, again, biology is complex. These are microscopic structures we're talking about, and there are humans working with these things. It's not a perfect science. And so nobody wants to be held criminally liable for anything. And if once you start making laws about embryos, it's people are going to say, you know what, I don't want to take that risk. Clinics shut down because they said, we want to know what the potential ramifications are of this decision before we continue to practice, because it could put our docs at risk, our clinics at risk of being criminally prosecuted.
And I know here in Idaho that that happened around the time that our last legislative session was underway. There was a piece of legislation to go through our state code and replace the terms embryo and fetus with the phrase preborn child. And that bill was then pulled back around this time. It wasn't explicitly tied to that decision out of Alabama, but I think it's fair to connect the dots there. That specific lawmaker is not returning to the next legislative session, but I would not be surprised if we saw some sort of push for fetal personhood to be added into state law here in Idaho. Can you talk more about the fetal personhood framework and how that interacts or conflicts with these type of procedures?
I overall, what I would say is words matter, and how we define these terms and these words differs. And we all have really strong feelings as humans. We all have really strong feelings about children, about family, about love, and why we want to have babies. So I understand that people are passionate about these things. But when we're talking about patients who are struggling with real disease, again, we need to be careful, because when things are written certain ways, they can have unintended consequences and actually hurt people. I don't, have specific examples of different laws that have been written and how they've impacted our ability to practice IVF per se. But again, if you look at what happened in Alabama, you could see that if we are using words in a certain way, calling an embryo a person or a child or an unborn human, it's going to make people feel that they're not comfortable practicing IVF, and it could prevent people from becoming parents.
All right, Dr. Emily Jungheim with the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Northwestern University. Thanks for your time this week.
Thank you. It was good to be with you. Appreciate it.
This interview was made possible by Sciline, a service of the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Union Pacific Railroad, serving Idaho for more than 160 years. A proud partner of Idaho Public Television. Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.